and I'll say good morning or good afternoon or good noon, whichever one it is for you. And I hope if you're having lunch that this doesn't spoil it. I hope it's going to be actually a good lunch. But we'll see what happens. So this is, you see the title. I put a slightly different title on it, but I actually kind of like this one because I think that the word trusted is interesting because of where we get this framework from. The guy who thought of it, or my interpretation of it anyway, is a guy named Michael Porter, who's probably written more on strategy than any other 5 people in the world. And I think this, there's lots of ways to do strategy, develop strategy, and do strategic planning. This is one. It's one that I trust because I know it works. But it's not. I'm certainly not going to say it's the only one that one should ever consider. Henry Mintzberg at McGill has written a book called Strategy Safari that takes you through 9 different approaches to developing strategy. So that tells you there are different ways to do it. So anyway, let me get started. My objectives in this webinar are threefold. I want to introduce and explain the process that we use to develop business strategy. I know they're together, but I actually think of developing strategy as a different thing than planning and implementing, or planning and how to implement it for your farm or any business for that matter. So I do separate those two things. And so the second one is to talk about the process to implement it and plan for the implementation of it on your farm. The third is to tie the previous webinar where we talked about some financial ratios into the process. And I think at the end of that webinar, I talked about why I started with the financial ratios first and tried to illustrate it. And then we'll come back with some examples toward the end of this one where we'll do that again. Okay. So I want to underline what I said at the outset. Our planning process is based on a number of ideas that were put together by Michael Porter from Harvard University. And I like the way I say this as translated by Joan Magretta. Michael's probably written 15,000 pages over his lifetime, but Joan summarized it into 296 in this book called Understanding Michael Porter. And it's the one we use for our course, and I think it's just a wonderful book on strategy and strategic planning. So I thought we should let you know. And I can see I have a light on over my head, and I'm going to turn it off just a second. Okay, that may be better with less glare. There's a few principles behind the way, at least I interpret this process, that I think are important. Number one, customers define value. Different customers have different definitions of value. And to me, strategy is about deciding what value you're going to provide from your operation and how you're going to provide it. So that will kind of underlie the whole process that we use. Secondly, once you have decided how you're going to provide value, then you have to make sure that all aspects of your internal value chain are aligned to do so. And I will try to talk about what I mean by the value chain. Thirdly, I strongly feel this way these days, or especially these last 2 points. If you can't manage it if you don't measure it. And so we will talk about measurement of both the process of implementation, but also the measurement of what you put into the strategy process. And I can't underline this one enough. Plans should be written and they should be used to manage. There's 2 different thoughts there. One is you need to write them down. And secondly, once you've written them down, it's not enough just to write it down. You actually have to use it in the management process. And I will briefly address how that all ties together toward the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's start with the definition of strategy, which I think is one of the most misused words in business. The way Magretta and Porter define it is it's the set of integrated choices that define how you will achieve superior performance in the face of competition. So it's your strategy is not your goal, for example, to be number 1. That's not a strategy. It's not to build a new barn or rent more land or to hire more people. Those are actions. Those are not strategy. Strategy is all of the above plus more. It's about how you go about positioning your farm organization to achieve a goal, and that could be your vision or it could be your value proposition. I think in the long term it's vision, in the short term it's value proposition, and there will be other measures that you will use within the plan. So how are you going to position yourself to achieve your goals, and what are the actions taken to achieve that positioning? And I hope we'll define some of those terms as we go through, starting right now. Positioning reflects choices you made about how the kind of value you'll create and how you will go about creating it. So you may be a farmer who is creating value by producing a large quantity of high quality commodity production or product. And if that's the case, then that you're creating value through that, trying to be as low cost as possible. And so you're going to set up your internal supply chain to make sure that, or value chain, to make sure you're as low cost and consistent as you possibly can. If your choice on your value proposition is to create value of local food, organically produced, for example, that is provided to people at your farm or at your farm market and so forth, that's a totally different proposition, and you're going to have a totally different internal value chain to go about producing it. So the positioning has to do with those two things together. How are you creating value, and how are you going about creating value? Your strategy is what defines what makes you unique. And that's quite interesting, because I see that uniqueness as a really key factor. How do you do something that, when you're in a commodity production industry, what makes you unique so that in fact you are more profitable than the average? It will also define what you won't do. So if your value proposition is that that you're going to be the low cost producer of a high quality of product, there's a whole bunch of things that means you're not going to do that will raise your cost and not actually perform or help you perform the way you want to. I mentioned this a minute ago, but there's very clear in their definition about what superior performance is. And that is, in business, it's return on invested capital that's higher than the industry average. So there's a couple of ways to measure that question, or that number. What's the return on invested capital? The easy way to do it is what's your earnings before taxes as a percentage of your total assets. And my experience in agriculture, from looking at a lot of data over the years, is that if you measure it that way, the average is somewhere between 5 and 7% return on invested capital, or on assets. And so therefore, the question that you're looking at is, how do I get to the point where I'm consistently earning 10% or more, or 8% or more, in order to be able to be higher return than the industry? That's not on your equity, that's on your total invested capital. So that's the answer to the question down here. From what I can see, it's around 5 to 7%. So we're looking for a strategy that makes us more profitable than the average. Some people would say that's not very good, 5 to 7%, but it's a low margin industry over time. And so that seems like a pretty good number to me to be representative. So this is me paraphrasing Magretta on what strategy is, and I think this will underline the process that I'm going to outline. Strategy is the way you organize and focus your business's internal value chain to deliver on a unique value proposition to your target customers in order to earn profits higher than the industry average. I don't think that's inconsistent at all with what I just said when I was talking about Porter and Magretta. I think it's quite consistent, as a matter of fact. And except that I've added the word focus, because one of the things we find in the C-Team program is that one of the values that so many people get out of it is focus. Focus on what it is you're trying to achieve with respect to the value you're presenting, and then focus on how you make your supply chain or your internal value chain as efficient as possible in delivering on it. So our strategy has a little framework, and I show it diagrammatically. In the next slide, actually, I'm going to show it several times. And I'm probably going to change this. I'm beginning to think there's a better way to diagram it, but I haven't got there yet. Maybe it'll become apparent, I hope, as we go through this. Then I'm going to talk about the steps and the terms within the diagram. And I'm going to point out right now that part of the approach that we have is that, as you'll see, I'll just jump down here. We don't have vision and core values in the logical process. We think that vision and core values are kind of immutable, long-term, eternal, and they actually should inform the strategy process to make sure that it is consistent with the long-term vision and it's consistent with the core values. And I'll say more about that at the end. And I think that's all I need to say. Yeah, okay. Other than the introductory comment down here is that because of the principle that customers define value, the very first step in the process of planning is to examine your external environment. Many of you will know the term SWOT. I never could understand why we did it that way. SWOT means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. If you start with your strengths and weaknesses, it says that you're basically going to figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are against your past. I want to think about the threats and opportunities, especially the opportunities, to figure out where I'm going and then figure out where my current strengths and weaknesses are against where I'm going. So I'm going to start with the external, which would be the OT of SWOT. So the external environment is there, and the next page I'm going to define it. It's the examination of factors that affect your business that you do not control. Okay? What you're doing is searching for opportunity, the potential to create something that adds value for your buyers or end users, and I should say, or your potential end users or buyers, by solving their problem. We think about this in terms of these four categories, and there's a whole bunch of questions that we have that we line up around each one. So what are the trends in technology and the socioeconomic factors that are affecting your industry and may give you opportunity down the road? What are the changes in policies, laws, and regulations? Surely to goodness we know what this kind of thing is right now with the kind of changes we've had in a lot of laws and regulations within the country affecting agriculture in the last little while. We have the TPP affecting, or the CPTPP, I guess, affecting the potential for some industries and affecting, well, the potential anyway for some industries, whether it be the export industries or the supply managed industries. We have competitors' products and services to think about. I like to think about this from a Canadian perspective. So as we're looking forward at the moment to what's happening in the world, who are our competitors? Our competitors are countries with names like Russia, Ukraine, Brazil, Argentina, in particular those, the US, not surprisingly, Kazakhstan, and the like, and what's happening in those countries that are affecting us. So these three categories are kind of the big picture stuff. And what I like to do then is to boil it down to the last category of who are our current customers, who are our potential customers, and what do they want in the future? What do they want in terms of product? What do they want in terms of service? Intrinsic characteristics, that is the characteristics of the product itself, or the extrinsic, like local and like and so forth, that are the potential places for us to be specific in terms of adding value. Once we have defined that, and that's a big bunch of questions that I just kind of summarized, that leads us to the first thing in the what I call the cascade here, which is the value proposition. Value proposition results totally from your external analysis. It tells you it comes down to that question of what do your current or potential customers want, and how precisely are you going to think about responding to it, and do so better than your competitors within the constraints of policy, and making use of appropriate technology so that we have returns higher than the industry average. The value proposition has three components to it. And if you ever read Magretta, I always remember it's on page, I think, 96 of Magretta, that defines value proposition really precisely. Which product and service needs will you meet in your industry? For what set of customers and where in the supply chain? And at what relative price will we charge? Okay, and as I said before, once you define that, it also defines probably what you won't do. I want to see if I have an example here. Okay, so here's three examples. They're not terribly focused yet, but maybe they give you the examples of what I mean by the components of value proposition. So one farm might have a value proposition that will produce a consistent supply and quality of a commodity for established market intermediaries at commercial prices, gaining quality premiums where possible. So this is your typical commodity producer who is trying to be as efficient as possible, trying to understand what gets quality premiums in the industry. And that person is going to now go back and look at their supply chain and say, their internal supply chain, and say, how can I best position myself to do this? Another farm might say, we will provide a consistent supply of commodity, but we're going to sort for specific end-use features. We're going to deliver them just in time to end users at prices reflecting the values of the end-use features. So here we're doing some differentiation by doing some sorting. I had some folks in C-Team last week or a few weeks ago who were thinking about this from the perspective of we've got large livestock producers developing near where we are. Some of them are cattle, some of them are hogs. There's a bunch of characteristics that those people want for their cattle and their hogs. They would probably like just-in-time delivery. So maybe there's a way that we can actually have a consistent premium by providing a consistent value and taking the place of the intermediaries that are the grain industry, the grain elevators, and so forth. Okay, so that's a slightly different approach than this one, and it may position you quite differently. In this particular case I'm talking about, it may be that you need to work together with a group of other people who are doing the same thing in order to make sure that the quantities are there at the right times. And the third alternative, there's as many alternatives as there are markets out there, but another potential value proposition is we will provide an array of quality produce as the local supplier of choice to final consumers at our farm market or through our CSA or through our farmers markets at premium prices. So those are three examples of potential value propositions that we see sometimes in agriculture, and they can become very much more focused than that. But I wanted just to try to give you an example of what I meant by the elements of the value proposition. Once we have defined our value proposition, then we go to the internal environment. So again, here's the logic is we look at the external environment. What do our customers want? How are we going to try to, or which values are we going to try to respond to? Now, how do we go about organizing our internal environment so that we do it as efficiently as possible? So our internal environment is the next thing we're going to examine. So analysis of the things we do control within the farm business, which is your internal value chain. We're, again, as I probably just said, what we're trying to do is organize those internal factors to most effectively deliver consistently on your or our value proposition. We're asking what are the gaps we need to fill in order to deliver more effectively. And I like to use Porter's value chain model to be specific about identifying what needs to change to deliver, that should be delivered consistently and efficiently. So here's the value chain model. This is old. He did this way back in 1985. Nobody's found a better way to talk about this, I think. There are people who will take maybe 4 quadrants of the internal environment, but working with our C-Team folks, I really like this because it makes you think specifically about each aspect of your business, and therefore it makes you think specifically about making sure that each aspect is aligned. These 5 across here are the things that we call the direct ways of adding value. These are kind of the indirect ways that are supportive of the direct ones within the firm. What you're trying to do overall is to maximize that margin by thinking about how you use these things to maximize your revenue and minimize your cost given your revenue. So I'm going to, rather than talk about them here, I'm going to talk about them in a couple of more slides. So he identifies all the potential activities in a business that can contribute to value. As I said, the bottom row is the primary set of primary processes that are directly involved in creating something that has more value. So if you move inputs from someplace else to your farm, you're adding value to them. If you turn them into a product, you're adding value. If you move that product off your farm to a marketplace, you're adding value again. So the bottom row is the direct ways you do it. The upper activities are the supporting ways. So definitionally, the 5 primary activities go like this. 2 of them are inbound and outbound logistics, and that's the logistical cost of acquiring inputs to your production process and the logistical cost of your final products moving your final products to your customers. Obviously, the production and operations is a major one. So that's where you turn your inputs into final products. So it's on farms, it's generally seeding, protecting, harvesting, breeding, feeding, protecting, butchering. It may be packaging, depending on what you're doing. There's all sorts of things that may be included in your production operations, but those are typical ones. Marketing and sales is in many farms. If you're a commodity producer, it's basically sales with a pricing function in it. If you are a differentiated producer, there's going to be a marketing function. So that's promoting, branding, merchandising, doing the pricing, doing the actual sales acts of making transactions and so forth. For some businesses, not so many in agriculture, there may be after sales service that you do or guarantee. So one example, we visited a greenhouse in BC the other day that produces a lot of flowers that go into grocery chains. And one of their after sales services is actually a major point of differentiation for them, is that they figured out that grocery chains haven't got a clue how to manage plants and flowers in a grocery store. And so they have actually started taking over the management of grocery stores offerings of flowers and plants in the stores, because they can do it much more effectively and much cheaper than the grocery stores can. And we saw a great illustration of it, because right after we went to the greenhouse, we actually went to a grocery store that they didn't operate in, and it was cold, and the flowers are right there by the cold doors, opening up and closing up and opening up and closing up with the electric eye, thereby underlining that grocery chains don't have a clue how to manage plants. So those are the direct ones. The supporting activities are procurement, which is your purchasing. It's not the logistics anymore. It's now, how do you find vendors? How do you go about negotiating prices for your inputs? The second one is your HR management. It's how you recruit, hire, train, motivate, reward, and retain your employees. The technological development is managing and processing information, staying current with technological advances while managing costs. And the last one is infrastructure, which on any business is accounting, legal, administrative, and general management. For farms, you can put these in HR. I like to put them in infrastructure because they're so key to many farms. Or who are your key people and how you're going to go about succession. Part of this, succession to me is not a separate thing. It's part of your strategic planning process and should be integral to it. So to me, it belongs in the infrastructure area. So what you're doing in this process is asking the question, how can I manage my value chain better in order to consistently deliver on that value proposition. So what you're doing is fundamentally two different things. One is I'm going to look at each activity, so my procurement or my HR management or my production, and say, what are the cost drivers in each activity or between activities, because it is part of a value chain. What are the cost drivers, and how can I figure out how to manage them better to lower my fixed and or my variable cost? The second question I'm asking is, what are the differentiation drivers in each one that I can use to add value for my customers? So I'm looking at each one of them and saying, what am I, and I'm really benchmarking against myself, against my potential, against others in my industry. Sometimes you're going to look outside your industry. If I'm doing something where I'm delivering products to consumers, where would I look better from a benchmarking perspective than at FedEx or somebody like that? So sometimes the benchmark is from outside your direct industry, but we're going through a process of understanding what all these things are, what the costs are, what the value of the differentiation is, and how to make it better. The other adjunct question to this is that you can often ask, I'm seeing farmers. You think of grain farmers as being commodity producers, but I see some grain farmers who are going to processors, for example, and saying, what can I do that will add value to you? Lots of times it is making sure that there's just-in-time delivery, making sure that you got a consistent supply in there. But you're actually saying, what can I do to solve your problem? If I can help you lower your costs, you should be sharing some of that with me and giving me a premium for it. Actually, it works sometimes, believe it or not. So that's kind of the idea. Again, there's 1,000 questions in here. Well, I just said this a minute ago. How do others in my industry add value? Are there other industries that have better approaches to adding value? How do we add value in our business, and how can we do it better? And finally, what are the gaps? What things can we do better in each of those 9 areas of the value chain that we can then improve on in delivering consistently on the value proposition? Whoops, wrong one here. The internal analysis is where also we include the financial analysis that we talked about the last time. It will give some additional quantitative evidence of how well parts of our value chain are working and where there are strategic strengths and weaknesses. If you recall, one of the gross, if you were on the webinar the last time, one of our benchmarks is that gross margin should be 65% of revenue. If yours is 55%, it suggests that you got problems in production, or you got problems in marketing, and or you got issues with procurement, because it means either your yields are too low, you're not getting enough for your final product, or you're paying too much for your inputs. So that's one of those things that's really helpful in looking at the aspects quantitatively, looking at the aspects of your internal value chain. This is a different set of farms that, again, than I showed the last time, and I'm using them to again illustrate how this stuff works together. So these are 2 actual farms that we've done benchmarking on. One farm has a gross margin of 55%. Their contribution margin, so that's their revenue minus their cost of goods sold, then minus their direct operating expenses, which is labor and the cost of operating their machinery. That gives them a contribution margin of 45%. Then they have their operating overheads, which are the costs of administration, legal, and so forth. We take that off, and that gives them an operating efficiency, or earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation of 20%. They have a current ratio of 2.5 to 1, which is pretty good, but they've got a debt to EBITDA ratio of 6 to 1, which means if they do nothing but pay down the principal of their debt using their operating earnings, it's going to take them 6 years to pay it off, which is higher than average, and it's fairly risky. Wait till we get over to Farm 1. So if I look at Farm 2 and I'm thinking about doing strategic planning, what this is telling me is that Farm 1's gross margin is way too low. That means that their production costs are too high, their cost of goods sold are too high. They have a fantastic 10% on their direct operating costs. So there's a problem here, but there's certainly not a problem here. I know this operation. This is really well managed operation in terms of what happens in the production process, but has lots of trouble with yields and prices of the final product. It has way too much overhead cost, and that's partly it's for a number of reasons, but it shouldn't be much above 10%, probably even less. And this is, as you can see, this was 25%, so it's ridiculously high. Not in bad shape for a current ratio, but if they want to grow, that debt to EBITDA is going to limit their ability to grow because it's too high. So from a strategic perspective, there are three things that this firm needs to work on. One is needs to get that gross margin up. And what it's finally doing to get the gross margin up is changing what it produces, because increasing yields and so forth didn't work. That still wasn't good enough. It is focusing on reducing some of its overhead costs, and eventually what both of those things would do is give us more operating earnings, which would automatically lower the debt to EBITDA ratio, which means that if we get those things fixed first, then we can probably have enough room down here to be able to borrow more money and grow if we want to. Farm 1, on the other hand, has a great gross margin, but they're spending the difference between 76% and 19% of their revenue on direct operating costs, which is mostly labor in that particular case. So that's 45% of their sales go to labor. About 11% of their sales go to operating overheads, which is not bad, but it's a little high. They have a terrible, as a result, they're only keeping 8 cents of the dollar from after paying operating costs, a dollar of sales after operating costs. They have a very tight current ratio, because they got less than $1 of current assets per dollar of current liabilities, and a whopping 10-to-1 debt to EBITDA ratio. I don't think this company's got any opportunity they shouldn't have any opportunity to borrow money because it's way too risky. And what they need to focus on is right here. We need to figure out how in heaven's name we're going to use our labor to generate more sales, or else reduce the amount of labor, because it's just costing us too much in here. And there's some operating costs in here too, as well as labor, but both of those things. So these ratios will help you figure out where the problems are in your operation, that helps you figure out then where to focus in your internal analysis. Okay, so with all of that stuff that goes in behind all those questions, there are 4 questions that we try to answer here. What are we doing well that we should continue doing in each of the areas? What are we not doing well that needs to improve? What are we doing that we should stop doing? And what are we not doing that we should do? And that takes us then to our strategic intents. And I can't generalize about this, but as I watch farmers putting these things together, the strategic intents always come up with a number of things that are very clear about what they need to focus on. So that first farm, for example, clearly needs to focus on 2 things. We need to improve our production efficiency, and we need to improve our overhead costs. The production efficiency in terms of the gross margin. The second one would have a strategic intent very clearly of reducing their direct operating expense as a ratio, which might mean increasing revenue from the labor. But those would both be examples of a strategic intent. So the kinds of things that I see as strategic intents are big picture things. They're not actions. So improve our production efficiency is often one. Improve our proficiency in marketing is often one. Increase our production capacity. Often it's enhance our management effectiveness, because we know that we are not very good at managing, especially as we're going to grow and we have more employees out there. These areas are, I think, that they're the strategic areas. They are either they are measurable themselves, or you can imagine the things that are going to be parts of them that are measurable. So if my intent is to improve my production efficiency, I better, for God's sake, make sure I've got some measures in there to say what my goals are and how and what will be an acceptable improvement. The same with proficiency in marketing. If you're a commodity producer, the easy one is I want to get myself to the point where my proficiency is such that my average price is in the top 10%, for example, of the year's annual price range for this commodity. There'll be other kinds of measures if it's a differentiation kind of product, like new customers or customer satisfaction, and so forth in terms of marketing. So these are all measurable, or their sub pieces to them are measurable. We try to never have more than, I say, 4, but sometimes we have 3, and occasionally I say I'll allow people I'm working with to have 5, because you can't focus on more than 3 or 4 or 5 things at a time, from any organization's perspective. And that leads us then to mission. I'm going to talk about it quickly, because interestingly, Porter and McGreta are not fans of mission statements. I don't care these days very much, but I'm with Porter and McGreta that most mission statements that I read are so generally vague and so long that they're not useful for management. They can be useful if you put them together with the strategic intents, because then you think of your mission as an integrated statement of what your 3 or 4 or 5 strategic intents are. So in this foregoing example, if I had a farm who's got these 4 strategic intents, then a mission statement, and I tried to do this, and I could probably make it shorter if I worked at it a bit, but this little mission statement of managing effectively to reduce costs or manage effectively to reduce costs and improve marketing of an increased amount of product would be a short phrase that includes all 4 of those strategic intents. I find them useful. I'm not as opposed as Porter and McGreta are. I find them useful if you do it this way and say it's an integrated statement of your strategic intents, because then it allows you to say to your staff or your customers, if it's important to your customers, but certainly to your staff, folks, this is what we're trying to achieve, and we want to keep this in front of us so we can stay focused on it. So that's it. All I'm going to say about it. The strategic intents are then the piece that go to operating plans and implementation. And I'm going to show this differently in a moment, but they are the basis. The strategic intents are the thing that drive implementation and performance measurement. They are the basis for quarterly or monthly operating plans. They say who will do what, when, with what resources, and what will be the measurable outcome. They are the basis for holding people accountable in management meetings. A lot of people I deal with say, we don't have very effective meetings, or we don't have any meetings, and therefore we don't have very good processes for managing people, and sometimes it's people within the family. So I find this process that takes the strategic intents and turns them into operations to be really useful for a whole bunch of things here. And folks, can you switch over to the Word document here and show it for a moment? Thank you. So this is the document that we use for for that translation. So you would fill this out. It's your farm. We've got the management team in here. It's for the planning period 2018. Here's your vision. Here's your value proposition. Okay, then we have 5 strategic intents, up to 5 strategic intents that we put in here. And now we go down to this. I have all this on a Word document, but with one of my clients, we've translated to a spreadsheet now, and that works really well too. So I don't know if I can make it bigger here. Yes, a little bit. So for strategic intent 1 in quarter 1, we'll have one of these for each quarter, and we have it set up for each strategic intent. In quarter 1, what major action are we going to take toward to increase? See, I left one in here. So increase the number of hogs for this particular person. What are the strategic intent? Or sorry, what are the major actions? Who is responsible for each action? What is the due date by when that action should be taken? What are the resource requirements? It could be time, it could be capital, it could be other hiring people. And what are the measures of whether it got done, number 1, and number 2, whether it had the right impact. So we do this for each one. At the end of the quarter, we will come back and have our management meeting and say, okay, this is what we said we were going to do this quarter. Did you do it? If you didn't do it, why not? How are we going to change it so that it gets done next quarter, or is it still appropriate that we do it, and so forth. This is I always think about this is where the rubber meets the road. The strategic intents up here are the things that we think are really important to redo our value chain. These are the actions that are going to get us there, and here's the process that we're going to use to hold people accountable. Okay, can we go back to the slides? I'm almost finished here, I hope. Okay, so that was shown separately. Thank you for that. So this goes back finally to the core values and vision. I said I'd say more about this at the beginning, but I want to just say again, the process starts with your external environment, defines your value proposition. This is your window to your customers. Then you look at your internal environment and say, how am I going to organize it most effectively to deliver consistently on my value proposition? That gives me my strategic intents after I go through my internal analysis. And then we turn that into the operating plans that hold people accountable and so forth. And we make sure we got the right management systems in place to do things. Vision and core values, as I said at the beginning, are things that I think are important to inform the operation or the plans at each year or each planning period. Long-term visions are really important to drive an operation. Visions and the core values of people define the culture of the company at the very least. We don't include them directly in the process of getting to an operating plan because they supersede everything. Value propositions and strategic intents have to be aligned with the long-term vision of owners about where they want to take the business in the long term. Operating plans must be aligned with core values. If honesty and transparency are important, then marketing plans that include misleading information are not possible, or else honesty and transparency really aren't core values. And I've seen a couple of managers who really do a wonderful job of defining the core values and then using them to make sure that elements of the plan and day-to-day operations are consistent with the core values. So they're important, but they're not in the general thing. Vision should be eternal, big enough and far enough into the future that we're always striving for it, but never quite getting there. I think Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream is a great example of it. The question is, where in the process does one identify the vision? I have 2 answers to that. If it's clear and well articulated already, then it goes to the front and it's used right away to inform the plan that you're undertaking. If it's not clear, which it often isn't in many operations when you're starting into strategic planning, my experience is that's best done either just after defining your value proposition or after defining your strategic intents. After your management team, which may be you and your wife or you and your dad or you and your kids or maybe a wider team, after the management team has already been talking about some of their dreams. Then it helps to put it together, and the opportunity. I'll stay with my script, I guess. The opportunity to talk among themselves about where they see their markets going, where they see their business going, helps identify whether their visions are the same or not. And we use a simple process after there's been ample discussion, and that is we ask each member to separately, by themselves, write an article to appear 10 to 20 years from now describing what your farm business did from today over the next 20 years or 10 years to earn a national award. And it's quite interesting how when you do that separately, after you've talked for a while, it's interesting how the vision kind of just drops out of those articles. I've used it 100 times and it works every time. If it doesn't work, if there's somebody in the team who writes a totally different article than everybody else, they probably don't belong there. And that's not a bad thing. It's just simply that you're not in the same in the organization that's going to get you to where you want to go. So you should probably look around. These articles define the shared vision. Then in subsequent planning periods, we start with the vision, and we always go back to the vision to start with. Has it changed? In years and years and years of working with companies, for the most part, it never changes, or it only changes marginally. And then you say, are we on track with the plans that we're doing now to make sure we're still there for next year? Yeah, I'm going to skip over this one. I think it's kind of repetitive of what I just said, and my time has passed on. So I'm going to go to this last slide. I think it's the last one anyway. Core values can be identified anytime in the process. I think it should be fairly early on in the process, at least implicitly. Then the plan and performance measured against them. Core values are the ethical foundations of your operations. It's what you value. It's what you should never allow people to not do. One of my favorite clients in British Columbia uses the core values to recruit employees and to let them go, because they'll say, part of your performance measure is, are you being consistent with the core values? If you are not, maybe this isn't where you belong. And they're very fine to let them go at that stage. So there are different ways that you can define these. It talks about how we treat each other in the business, how we treat our employees, our customers, our suppliers, our environment, our animals, and so forth, or what's really important in your operations, or it can be both. Customer service, continuous improvement, continuous learning, profitability. Those are all things that I see sometimes as being safety, respect, orderliness, and so forth, are all things that I see as core values by some companies. And I think that's my last slide. So I think I did all I needed to do with the summary, but the cascade here kind of summarizes the process.
Great. Thanks, Larry. This is the stuff I get up for in the morning, so I appreciate the 45 minutes that you spent with us. Yeah, I'm going to hog the spotlight for a selfish question. I go to a lot of these conferences throughout the year, especially the winter, and I find a lot of people confuse the value chain and the supply chain. And I know this is very basic, high-level stuff. Can you, in a few sentences, distinguish or paint out a good distinction between the two?
Well, the only country in the world where this is confusing is Canada, and it got confused because of the fact that we have supply management, and so people tend to use the word supply chain most places, and that got confused. So, to me, they're almost interchangeable. As you probably heard me say, I did actually use them interchangeably a couple of times. I caught myself doing it in the presentation, and I think it is okay for them. So let me go back here if I can to real quickly here, if I can get back to my slide. the other implication of it is that sometimes whoops, there it is. Sometimes people will use the value chain concept or the supply chain concept, either way, as describing the chain of business firms, whereas this thing talks about the steps within a firm. So if I'm a farm, I'm going to buy in fertilizer, and seed, I'm going to turn it into crops, I'm going to ship off my crops to somewhere, I'm going to do some marketing and so forth. So that's my supply chain and my value chain within the firm. Now, the value chain can also be, how do I link up with my seed supplier, for example, so that we can do things more effectively? How do I link up with my grain elevator or my processor so that I'm doing just-in-time shipping, as the example I used along the way, so I can reduce my efficiency? To me, they're all of those concepts are interchangeable. You are supplying, you are having the chain of events within the firm, or the chain of firms that are lined up with each other to supply the product. You're also having this chain of events that you use to add value. So to me, whether you say value chain or supply chain, you're saying the same thing. The only distinction I really think that's important to make when you're having a conversation is, are you talking about your internal value chain within your firm, or or supply chain, whichever one you're using, or are you talking about the value chain that you are a part of, that goes from beginning to end of the market process? I don't know. I hope that didn't confuse things, but I hope what it did is basically say there is no difference.
So I have a question from Mark here. With respect to the definition of superior performance and your experience specific to agriculture, does the 5 to 7% ratio change if you were involved in processing and exporting what you grow direct to customers?
Well, it should. I'm thinking of, when I see the 5 to 7%, I'm talking about numbers that come from farms who are basically farming a product, or just producing a product and not doing anything downstream or upstream. So I think that when you go downstream to processing and so forth, now you've changed the definition of the industry. So the industry that I'm measuring will be the cash grain producing industry. If I now get into downstream processing, it's a different industry. And yes, I would expect, why do you do that? Why would you go downstream? You go downstream because you expect to make more profit. So I would certainly say my expectations on profitability would be somewhat higher if I increase that. And my experience, which is limited in the industry, is that processing industries tend to look for somewhere in the neighborhood of 12% return on 10 to 12% on assets, or on invested capital. So that would be.
I've got another one, and something that is always asked here at Farm Management Canada. I'm sure you get and you talk a lot about with C-Team. What is an acceptable percentage of your final cost to put towards HR?
Well, that's really different in different industries. I use that really well-managed greenhouse in BC that I talked about the other day, which is a flower industry. They don't have very much automation, and their measure is 18.5%. So 18.5% of sales should be labor. If I'm on a cash grain operation, it better not be 18.5%. So it really depends on the industry. We're hoping out of the BDO project that I talked about in the last the last webinar. We're hoping to be able to come up with some numbers that will give more of that. But I think it's I think it really depends on the industry. Just think about it, Chris. The horticulture industry has much higher labor costs. I partially own a restaurant. If we can keep our back of the house and front of the house labor cost to 31%, we're doing really well. But that's a different industry.
Fair enough. Well, I think it's a good note to end on, because we're coming up to the 1 o'clock Eastern time and new time, since our clocks went ahead. Larry, thanks again. Part 2 of a trilogy. Tune in again to see Larry for the final part. Larry, what's that one entitled?
It has to do with being just about disciplined marketing strategies, and this is for commodity marketing. So this is not going to be on a differentiated product, but this is about how do you make a really good decision on a market like we just went through the last couple of weeks that got whacked on Thursday by the USDA report. How do you make decisions in that situation?
Well, I will be tuning in, and I'm sure everyone else will be. Ladies and gents, please stick around to fill out the poll as mentioned. Thank you very much again, Larry. AME, the program is C-Team. Check it out. And again, this is Chris Penton from Farm Management Canada saying good afternoon or late good morning. Bye-bye.